All right, good afternoon and welcome. My name is Ken Pope, and I'm the Director of Academic Programs for the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation. On behalf of VOC and our co-host, Human Events, it is my privilege to welcome you to our panel discussion, Marxism and Communist Ideologies, History and a Warning for Today. We have a truly distinguished panel that will discuss something that we seem to see quite a bit in the media today, or more and more each day, and that's conversations about ideology. Today, we'll explore the power of Marxist and communist ideology specifically and its impact on the nations that suffered under those regimes. Our panelists will examine the history, how and why ideology influenced those governments, and current events for signs of similar patterns today. To guide our discussion, we are very fortunate to have my friend Brent Hamachek, Executive Editor of Human Events, the oldest conservative platform in the US, to serve as our moderator. Brent is also a business operations manager for the media outlet Post Millennial. He is an opinion writer and author who co-wrote Charlie Kirk's first book, Time for a Turning Point. His most notable publication, it was his 2021 essay, Understanding and Embracing the Role of 21st Century American Dissident, which received worldwide attention and led to numerous lectures, media appearances, and events centered around the topic. His current project is promoting the Common Ground Campus program, for which he is a co-founder. Before I turn it over to my friend Brent, one quick admin note. As we go through the lectures or discussions, please use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen to give us questions that you would like to present to the panelists. With that said, welcome again, and Brent, over to you.
Thanks, Ken. It is an absolute privilege to be here and be able to host this event with the Victims of Communism Foundation. Very briefly, Human Events, Ken mentioned, has been around since 1944. And back in February of this year, I had a chance to sit down with two of the owners who dated back to the 1960s, Alan Riskin and Tom Winter. And when I asked them, what was your mission statement when you owned Human Events? They said it was to fight the Cold War and defeat communism. So our roots at Human Events were actually born in this battle about which we will discuss today. So today's event, the format will be a little bit like a mini lecture series and a little bit like a mini panel event. We have three very distinguished presenters who will each spend about 15 minutes addressing the topic of ideology and communism from their own perspective. And then when we're done, we'll have a bit of a discussion that'll take some of your questions, some of our questions. And my job is the easiest one to do. I get to just simply sit back and listen and facilitate the exchange of brilliance. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about each of our panelists. And to do that, I've got to put on a pair of old person reading glasses. For anyone who wants to laugh, all I can say is laugh now, your day is coming. So we will have, first of all, we will have Dr. Jonathan Brent, who is an academic and an author and a publisher. As publisher, he is the director of the Annals of Communism series, which he founded in 1992. He's currently the visiting Alger Hiss Professor of History and Literature at Bard College, and is also the CEO and Executive Director of YIVO Institute for Jewish Research in New York City. David Sater is a Senior Fellow at the Hudson Institute, a Fellow of the Foreign Policy Institute of Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies, and a longtime observer of Russia and the former Soviet Union. And Dr. Flagg Taylor IV, I almost said fifth, the reading glasses nearly failed me there, Doctor, serves on the Academic Council of the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation and is an Associate Professor of Government at Skidmore College. He holds a PhD and an MA in Political Science from Fordham University and a BA from Kenyon College. So welcome, gentlemen, all of you. It is a pleasure to have you. Are we all off mute? We're going to make sure. And so Dr. Jonathan Brent, I would ask you to lead us and kick off the presentations today, if you will. Give us your best 15 minutes of elucidation.
Thank you very much, Brent, and thank you, Ken, and thank you to Victims of Communism for this invitation. I want to begin the discussion with what might seem to be a little different approach to the subject of ideology in the sense that I want to look at the way it evolved. Because it strikes me that often what we take to be ideology is really how a system, in fact, operates in practice. And we take the justification for those practices to be the quote unquote ideology of the system. Ideology is a very slippery idea. It presumes that ideas are moving the people. And while that is certainly it was the aspiration of the Soviet system, the Bolshevik system, to do precisely that. Stalin is famous for having said that writers are the engineers of human souls, and that the new Soviet man will emerge from the conditions of building socialism in the Soviet Union. And there's a lot of evidence to believe that he believed this, that he believed that ideas, that ideology molded people. Alexander Yakovlev, who was the architect of perestroika under Gorbachev, a very fine man who I believe should have won the Nobel Prize, in his memoir, and in all of his post-Soviet writings, states something very simple. Violence is at the bottom of the Bolshevik system, and at the bottom of the Soviet system. Violence, state violence that was bent on the annihilation of the individual, state violence that was bent on the annihilation of freedom of every sort, individuality, and so on. But it wasn't always that way. In fact, in Literature and Revolution that Trotsky published before the revolution, he writes that the Soviet, the world of the revolution, of the socialist, communist victory will witness a tremendous flowering of culture, a flowering of culture that will rival that of the ancient Greeks, of the Renaissance, that man's spirit will rise to greater heights than those of Aristotle and Goethe. This is what he writes. So for him, that cultural profusion was not incompatible with communist ideology as he understood it. And yet, there is no question that what Trotsky envisioned, and Lenin as well, and Marx as well, turned into exactly what Yakovlev described. Unbearable violence, unbearable brutality, unbearable cruelty against the individual, against all the things that we take to be sacred in our lives, families, relationships, individual aspiration. I'll never forget when, after having started the project that Brent mentioned, the Annals of Communism, I invited the head of the Central Committee Archive to come to Yale University. And she saw the operation of Yale University Press, and she saw editors working quietly at their desks. And she saw that it was a flourishing operation. And she turned to me and she said something I'll never forget. She said, "How do you get these people to work? What is their motivation for wanting to work?" She said, "I can't get people to work. They have nothing to work for." And this, of course, is one of the most tragic legacies of that system that destroyed individual initiative, destroyed the individual ego, or what in a particularly wonderful document from the Central Committee in 1957, a writer called the greatest enemy of the Soviet state What was that? Was it America? No. Was it ICBMs? No. What was it? It was the bourgeois ego. That was the greatest enemy of the Soviet state, and that's why they had to ban Dr. Zhivago, because at the center of it was the bourgeois ego. So I want to talk a little bit about the creation of this so-called ideology, because unless we understand the way it formed, we can't really talk about how to prevent it from reappearing, because it will reappear in other forms. It need not necessarily take the form of Bolshevism. It could easily take the form of Nazi fascism or of other equally virulent ideologies. It's important to understand that the Russian Revolution was not the product of this ideology at all. The Russian Revolution was the product of the total collapse of civil society in the wake of World War I. It was the total discrediting of Tsarism because of the war, the complete destruction of civil society, the paralysis of the transportation system. We today see in our daily lives what the paralysis of our transportation system is producing. We call it supply chain issues. Well, in 1917, those supply chain issues brought the entire Russian civilization to a halt. They could not get goods from the country to the cities, from the cities to the country, and back and forth. The roads were impassable. 6 million Russians died as a result of that war, or were maimed and injured as a result of that war. It was universally hated at all strata of Russian society. In 1914, 1 ruble bought enough food for 1,400 calories of a normal worker, 1 ruble. In 1970, that same ruble bought 168 calories. So the devaluation of their currency was catastrophic for that society. And in the wake of that society, the provisional government, the Tsar abdicated and the provisional government was formed. Not the Bolshevik government, the provisional government. And it was only because of the fact that Kerensky tried to resurrect the Russian Empire by means of a failed offensive in the summer of 1917 that Lenin finally saw his chance. Why? Because the army didn't want to fight anymore. And why did it not want to fight? Part of it, yes, was because the Bolsheviks were promising land and peace and a whole variety of other things that they never delivered on. But they were just exhausted. It was an exhausted country. And this exhausted country was ripe for the taking. And there were a lot of different groups that were going to take it. The Bolsheviks were not the strongest power at that time. The whites far outnumbered them. Furthermore, the whites, that is to say the monarchists, had the military class. They had the generals. They had the arms. And they put up fierce battles with the Bolsheviks. But they were disorganized. They had no communication, one group with the other. And eventually they lost what? They lost the popular vote because of the fact that the whites insisted on the restoration of the empire and the Ukrainians didn't want that. So Lenin didn't seize power because of his ideology. If anything, he seized it because of his slogans: bread and power to the Soviets, peace and land. Slogans that meant nothing at the time. And furthermore, excuse me, I have to keep track of this time. Okay. And otherwise Brent will kill me and it'll be ugly.
Death would not come. It would be a simple raising of the hand. Please continue. This isn't Soviet America just yet.
Okay. And it was because of this chaos that we cannot ever lose sight of the fragility of that society and that civilization, that Lenin just walked in and took over. What was it that created the violence? Well, in 1917, in fact, in August and September of 1917, he was just finishing State and Revolution, one of his major works. And in State and Revolution, he predicts that once the revolution is accomplished, we will be able to get rid of the police and we'll be able to get rid of the military, and people will spontaneously wish to cooperate with each other. And what did he find? In 1918 alone, there were over 200 peasant rebellions. And what was the consequence of this? The consequence of this was a memo that he wrote to a variety of his fellow Bolsheviks, in which he says, the uprising of the 5 kulak districts should be mercilessly suppressed. The interests of the entire revolution require this now. Hang without fail no fewer than 100 known kulaks, rich men, bloodsuckers, publish their names, steal their grain, designate hostages, do it in such a way that for hundreds of versts around, people will see, tremble, know, shout. They are strangling and will strangle to death the bloodsucker kulaks. This is the same man who just a year previously had predicted they could get rid of the military and the police. What was it that was motivating this? It was protecting the interests of the revolution. What was protecting the revolution all about? It was protecting the interests of the party. What was protecting the interests of the party all about? It was about protecting his power and the power of the ruling group. And so the ideology that emerges from all of this is an ideology of the protection of power. And we can't lose sight of that. And this is power that can either be Bolshevik, or it can be Hitler, fascist, or it can be something else. But it is power and the protection of it that is at the root of this. And now you ask, well, why couldn't they protect this with democratic means? Why couldn't they come to some other consensus? They could not, because the country had fractured. It had fractured into the monarchists who were in league with the cadets of the Provisional Government. It had fractured with the Mensheviks who were at war with the Bolsheviks, the anarchists who were against everybody, the SRs, and today we see this, the Ukrainian nationalists who violently opposed all of them in the interests of promoting a narrow nationalistic agenda in Ukraine. And they could not come to any agreement. They had no means for doing so. Civil society had obliterated the means for doing so. And furthermore, they had no traditions of liberal democracy, none. And so violence becomes the only tool, as the historian Oleg, I've forgotten his name, but this great young Russian historian, Oleg Khlevniuk, has said, violence becomes the only tool they had to solve problems. And that was the tool that they employed over and over and over again. You ask, well, why is the individual ego that which is annihilated in this system? Well, it wasn't always that way. It really wasn't. But there was something called the Kronstadt Rebellion that took place in 1921 at the same time as the 10th Party Congress. And who was involved in the Kronstadt Rebellion? They were the Red Sailors. They were communists. They believed in the system. And the fact that they revolted in 1921 against the Red Army, against the Bolsheviks in Moscow, showed Lenin and all of those around him how tenuous their grasp of power was. And at exactly that point, they pass a resolution that becomes binding for the entirety of the rest of the scope of the Soviet Union on the sanctity of the unity of the party. They reject absolutely any dissent within the party. And they talk furthermore about the one single most devilish thing that the system produces. They talk about the need to uncover those who claim that they're Bolsheviks, but they're really cadets. Those who are actually really whites, but are posing as Bolsheviks. In other words, anyone who disagrees with us is now no longer a Bolshevik. And this has echoes in our own day, which perhaps you will be sensitive to. And it is a most dangerous thing. I don't know, Brent, am I out of time?
You were perfect. There'll be no interrogation, no internment.
Okay.
You are safe. So thank you so much for that. That was a terrific way to get started. And David, I know that you have some stories and things to share for people that will really bring this home to follow up behind Jonathan's remarks. So please, if you will, give us your 15 minutes of insight, and the floor, or the computer screen, I guess, as it is yours.
Thank you very much. I take it you can hear me okay?
You're fine. Yes, you have good volume.
Okay, great. Well, I mean, the question of ideology, which is the topic of our discussion, is the most important question when it comes to Soviet history. And it's an important question actually for the modern world, because ideology was the essence of the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was a theocratic state, or at least it had a theocratic structure. And the ideology was the false religion. The whole system in the Soviet Union was based on the imposition of a false idea. And the false idea was the ideology. Marxist, Leninist ideology as a tool of domination was unequaled. And as a justification for violence, it was unequaled, because it set about to reinterpret all aspects of given reality. Marxism is more than just a philosophy, although it's the product of a philosopher. It's in fact a false religion and an attempt to reinterpret all existing reality. And that interpretation was characterized by the fact that, unlike the interpretations of reality which came down to us from the Greek philosophers and the New and Old Testament, it presumed the absence of God. The Soviet Union was the first state in human history to be created explicitly on the basis of atheism. It was supposedly the expression of a perfect science, and the leaders of the Soviet Union were those who were endowed with the ability to understand the science and apply it to all aspects of life. Now, the science itself was a false science, and it made certain prediction. All science is empirically verifiable. You can make assumptions on the basis of the science, and you get predictable results. Well, the result and the science of Marxism, Leninism also made predictions. Among the predictions were the end of class conflict, the end of war, unlimited freedom, and unlimited prosperity. Well, none of that happened. So in effect, the science of Marxism, Leninism, was easily demonstrated to be a false science. And the leaders who were in charge of interpreting this ideology and imposing it on a helpless population were faced with a dilemma, because the science was proved to be false. The science was the basis for their rule. It was the science that justified their violence, and the science proved to be bogus. And what they did was they simply set about creating reality. They compelled an entire nation to act out a false version of reality. Of course, there was no end to class conflict, and there was no end, and there was no prosperity. But if you control information, and if you can intimidate people with the help of the secret police, it doesn't matter. You can pretend as if in fact the predictions of the ideology are being realized, and that the ideology is itself true. So an entire system of lies was imposed on a vast country. And in fact, it proved to be an exceptionally effective device of domination. Because once you can force people to lie, and the way to do that is through unlimited violence, you can break their spirit and end all resistance. And the Soviet population was turned into a complying and servile mass of people who had lost the capacity for individual judgment and the individual and the capacity for individual moral reasoning. They took their view of reality exclusively from that which was imposed on them by the regime, and which the regime devised from its false religion, from its ruling doctrine, from its ideology. The ideology was applied to all aspects of life. For example, the Soviet Union was a multinational country, and each of the countries that composed the Soviet Union had their own national history. But the ideology stated that the logical culmination of the history of the Estonians, the Ukrainians, the Armenians, and all of the other people who comprised the Soviet Union was the creation of the communist system. This was impossible, of course, without falsification. But they didn't worry about falsification, because anyone who tried to challenge the existing and official version of reality could simply be repressed. It was the same thing with the working class. They, of course, did not live in conditions that were comparable to those of workers in the West. But that reality could be completely denied and concealed with the help of violence. And the Communist Party itself could be turned into a rigid instrument of ideological control, which had a single opinion and tolerated no others because of the regime's monopoly on violence. And this system, the combination of ideology, a false religion, and unlimited terror, which could turn falsehood into truth, or into something that resembled truth, that could be a substitute for truth, and that could be imposed on people as if it were the truth. That system was the system of totalitarian domination that existed in the Soviet Union. And it was that system that justified the Soviet Union's horrific crimes, because there were no moral limits to limit the drive for power of the authorities. And they took their ideological beliefs to be higher than any religion and higher than the moral systems that are included in any religion. Well, this system was more or less invulnerable as long as it was unchallenged, but it led to stagnation, a system in which people are controlled on the basis of a false idea, in which they are compelled to act out these false ideas, of course, cannot be efficient and could not compete in the long run, economically or militarily, with the West. This is something that the Soviet leaders came to understand. And they began, after Gorbachev came to power in 1985, to take steps to dismantle this system. But they chose to try to dismantle it in their own interest by allowing just enough truthfulness to allow the population to demonstrate at least a minimum of dynamism and initiative. The problem was tolerating truthful information in the framework of a system that's based exclusively on lies could only destabilize the system. A division was opened up between the world of lies and the space that had been created for truthful information. And one or the other had to be destroyed. Ultimately, it was the system of lies that was destroyed, because as soon as people became exposed to the truth, all the fault lines in the society began to be exposed. People began to realize all the things that they had been told were in fact not true, and had been imposed on them in the interests of their rulers. At the same time, the process of glasnost, the process of perestroika, proved impossible to stop, because as more and more people became supporters of the new freedom, the regime had to retreat in terms of its ability to impose repression. In 1991, 6 years after Gorbachev came to power, there was a last-ditch attempt by communist hardliners to reimpose the ideology by force. But it was already too late. There were too many people who had experienced truthful information and a degree of freedom and were not ready to go back to living in a false world based on an absurd theory that was imposed on them by a small group of totalitarian leaders, and the regime was overthrown. Problem was that after the end of the Soviet Union, a real revolution in consciousness did not take place, because communism and living in a world of lies had left its traces on people's psychology. Many people had lost the habit of thinking in moral terms and lost the habit of thinking of the individual as the bearer of a conscience. When the reforms of Russia began, there was no realization that the fundamental principles of communism, the idea that the individual counts for nothing, that the only thing that matters are the objectives of the state, that was not abandoned. The economic system was changed. and under new conditions. And the transition from socialism or communism to capitalism, what was created was criminal capitalism and a criminal regime, which paved the way for a new domination of Russia, of Russians, and this also happened to some extent in other former Soviet republics, by corrupt authoritarian regimes which had as little disregard for the individual as the communist regime from which they had emerged. So the curse of communist domination, the curse of universal lying, did not disappear with the fall of the Soviet Union. And the curse of ideological thinking has since spread out over the whole world to some degree. The communists had their supporters when the Soviet Union existed. And many of those people knew the ideology, and they were, in fact, dedicated members of the Communist Party. We don't have that now. But the prejudices and the habits of ideological domination continue to affect the world. And the malign assumptions of communist ideology, the basic assumption that there is no higher source of authority, which of course could only come from a faith in a transcendent point of reference or in faith in God, does not exist, and that the world is based only on conflict, can be adapted to all of the conflicts that now exist in the United States. The conflict so-called between racial groups, between sexes, between economic classes. It doesn't matter that the people who are calling themselves Marxist in the US, for example, do not understand the ideology and don't really understand the implications of what they're saying. They take a few random pieces of the ideology which are particularly detrimental and use it to justify whatever extreme beliefs they happen to hold. And that's the way it functioned in the Soviet Union, and the way it tends to function today, as a justification for the failure to think, as a superficial framework for thought that is in fact false, but requires effort to analyze. So as a result, the ideology which enslaved the people of the Soviet Union for so long, and which continues to plague the people of Russia, and which is at the root, in fact, of the conflicts which are now going on, and the war against Ukraine, is also a threat to the West, and requires once again that kind of moral awareness that makes it possible to understand what the real roots of our tradition are, and how much more valuable they are than any kind of artificial construct of lies that can be imposed on people with the help of a false idea. Now, I don't know if that's 15 minutes or not. I hope it is.
It's just about on the nose, David. It's very good. Dr. Taylor, you're going to have an extraordinary amount of pressure on you to follow these last two speakers, at least from a time perspective. We'll see how you do on content. But thank you to the first two gentlemen for being so clear, concise, and on point and on time with your remarks. Dr. Taylor, the floor is yours for 15 good minutes before we kick some ideas around together as a group.
Great, thank you so much. Thanks to the VOC and Ken Pope for putting it together, and thank you, Brent, for moderating. It's also great to be on a panel with two scholars whose work I admire. I have their books next to me. Maybe I'll bring them out in a little bit. In my time today, I want to argue that one can locate the destructive core of communism precisely in its ideological nature. Communist regimes, in this telling, are totalitarian regimes precisely because they're ideological. Many scholars who use the term totalitarian identify ideology as just one feature among many, but in this view, ideology really is the central feature, and it's the reason why these regimes become totalitarian. I should say that this is by no means a consensus view or even a particularly common view today, although early observers of the Soviet project hinted at such a conclusion without putting it in exactly these terms. I'll give you two examples from self-identified communists. The first is from a French communist named Boris Souverin, who's a biographer of Stalin. He wrote this in 1937. He said, quote, "The USSR is the country of the lie, the absolute lie, the integral lie. Stalin and his subjects are always lying at every moment, under every circumstance, and by dint of lying, they no longer know that they're lying." And that very, unquote, in that very same year, a Yugoslav communist called Anton Siliga published a book about his experiences in Russia over the past decade before he was expelled. Translating from the French title of that book, it's called The Land of the Disconcerting Lie. It was published in 1937. And later in the 20th century, some of the greatest dissident analysts would also identify this feature of lying as the central character of communism. You could talk about Alexander Solzhenitsyn, the great Russian novelist, the Czech dissident playwright Václav Havel turned statesman, and the Polish poet Czesław Miłosz. They all identified the lie as having this central role in these regimes. So to put the matter starkly, I agree with the French historian Elaine Besançon, who writes that the basic element in communism, or the key element at any rate, is ideology. If you understand the one, you will understand the other. And if you don't understand it, Besançon wrote, you will understand nothing. Now, the principal obstacle in terms of understanding communism in this way is the way that we use the term ideology today. Sometimes we use the term to mean something like worldview. We all kind of have an ideology then. Or we often mean a set of guiding ideas that might be grouped under some term that we then designate with an ISM, an ism at the end. So conservatism, liberalism, socialism, feminism, fascism, et cetera, all these are ideologies. And this is sadly how the matter is treated in most introductory political science textbooks. But I want to suggest that this way of thinking about ideology obscures fundamental differences between ideas and regimes. And most importantly, it obscures the true nature of communism. So I'd like to get at the distinctive nature of ideology properly understood by looking at central characteristics of ideological regimes. And I first want to look at the characteristics from the standpoint of an adherent or believer. Then I'll walk through similar characteristics, but this time from the perspective of an outside observer. And then finally, I'll be in a position to offer some definitions of ideology properly understood. So first characteristic of ideology in this distinctive sense, it offers a comprehensive doctrine that applies to every aspect of one's life. Every aspect. It's supposed to explain everything. So the novelist Arthur Koestler reports that after adopting Marxist-Leninism, quote, "the whole universe fell into a pattern like the stray pieces of a jigsaw puzzle." So it has to have this comprehensive character. Second, this ideology, so understood, has to offer a complete and fundamental break with an unjust and benighted past. To adopt the ideology is to join a movement that intends to destroy and even negate this past. So as Jonathan mentioned in his presentation, the Soviets proclaimed quite openly their intention to create a new Soviet man, right? And to do that, you had to get rid of any remnants, right, of the previous order. And so you have to dispose people towards hatred towards this past. Third, such an ideology is based on a purportedly scientific understanding of history and its logic. David just mentioned this. And this is what Marx proclaims set his understanding of socialism apart from all of the mid-19th century, in Marx's mind, pretenders, right? Marx said, I'm the only one that has this scientific understanding of socialism. And so once you join the Communist Party, you affirm this necessary movement of history. And having that knowledge would make you part of an elect, right? You would feel like you were a special possessor of this scientific knowledge. And this is why the main character, Rubashov, who's the protagonist of Kessler's novel Darkness at Noon, in that great book, he can't stomach leaving the party because he understands that leaving the party would seem to leave him outside of history altogether. It would kind of be, the equivalent of leaving the party would be something like self-annihilation, right? And this is why so many people had such trouble extricating themselves from the world of ideology once they entered into it. Fourth characteristic, the ideology is characterized by an extreme inner logicality. This is what Hannah Arendt, the great philosopher, German emigre, called the murderous alphabet of ideological thinking. If you accept A, then you must accept B, then C, right? Jonathan alluded to this in his presentation, right? If you accept the proletariat is the universal class, then you must accept that the party is the entity to rule in its name. Then you must accept that the party has the best interest of the proletariat at heart. Then enemies of the party are the enemies of the proletariat, right? All the way down the line. And so the party tolerates no lack of clarity or no doubt, right? Once you enter into that inner logicality. Siliga, the Yugoslav communist that I mentioned earlier in his book, he mentioned something like this when he's talking about doubt. He says, quote, "In those conditions, all leaning towards doubt disappeared. Those who at the outset had expressed their doubts in the end mounted the platform to excuse themselves for having misunderstood," right? No doubts permitted. And then finally, the fifth characteristic of an ideology in this sense, the adoption of the ideology, and I think this is important to remember, I'm not sure it's been emphasized yet by either of the previous speakers, it offered fraternity, or at least it was supposed to offer a kind of deep sense of fraternity, right? One participated in the collective movement that was freighted with meaning, and it led to a kind of self-forgetting where one's personal troubles seemed insignificant, right? And one's identity becomes fused with this movement that is supposed to bring an end to all suffering and all alienation, right? So that fraternity, however much it failed afterwards to create that was the promise. And I think it probably succeeded to an extent, at least initially, in giving people that sense of belonging. So those are the characteristics from the standpoint, again, from an adherent or a believer. Now, I think it's helpful to kind of look at the characteristics from someone who's standing on the outside, right? Who's not necessarily a true believer. So the first characteristic from the outside, the theoretical elaboration of the ideology requires a specific application. The other way to put this would be that an ideology in this sense collapses the space between theory and practice, and the party becomes the center of both, right? And so once the principles are there, the practice is obvious, or should be obvious to everyone. So the party tries to obfuscate that there's any space between theory and practice. Havel writes about this in the following way. He suggests that the Communist Party is dedicated to perpetuation of a pseudo-reality, and it has to paper that pseudo-reality over the reality that people experience with their eyes and ears. And so that pseudo-reality comes to have a greater weight in Havel's telling than reality as such. And so Havel goes so far as to say that the significance of phenomena no longer derive from the phenomena themselves, but from their locus as concepts in the ideological context. Havel says reality does not shape theory, but rather the reverse. It's theory itself, ritual itself. That's what seems to make the decisions that affects people. And that's why people experience this ideology as very alienating, right? It's the opposite of what Marx had predicted. It doesn't solve the alienation problem. It actually makes it worse. Second characteristic from this observer standpoint is the foundation of the legitimacy of the party, its reach and its power must be total, at least in intention. Because if the ideology can be questioned, then the party's reason for being can also be questioned, right? Either the party has knowledge that's supposed to lead us into this glorious future, or it doesn't. And so the party can acknowledge no limits to its knowledge and acknowledge no dissent. And this is why the so-called leading role of the party can never be forsaken, even by the people who wanted to reform the party. Someone like Alexander Dubček in the former Czechoslovakia, right? He wanted to change things for the better, but even Dubček would not forsake the leading role of the party. Third characteristic, the party strives to achieve a kind of perfectly unified society, but it does it through perfect fragmentation, right? So all autonomous social institutions need to be broken up and recreated with ideological conformity in mind. So there are no social institutions, not even the family, that is allowed to have an integrity or a logic of its own. Society is treated as amorphous matter to be shaped and disciplined by the party. Fourth, communism has a utopian, or what I would call perfectionist, character. It seeks some absolute union of all good things or all values. Here I quote the Hungarian philosopher Arel Kolnai. He wrote, "Perfectionism does not mean loving or desiring the good or some value too fervently. It means loving the good arbitrarily under its most perfectionist aspect, as if it must represent an all-good world, a togetherness and finished harmony of good things." And so the perfectionist mind seeks the convergence of good as the result of some necessary movement of history. So if we realize perfect equality, then we'll also have perfect justice, an end to alienation, right, and all of these other good things. But it's a completely arbitrary evaluation and positing, right, of these values. And then finally, the last characteristic from the standpoint of an observer, David kind of finished his remarks with this point. But individuals in an ideological regime are freed from the notion of individual responsibility or moral agency, in the sense that you sort of turf that responsibility to the ideology and to the party, right? In sort of normal moral life, we identify goods and bads, and we take the goods of others as our own good when we do good for others. Living in an ideological regime means that this very routine and normal process of moral agency is always displaced by the ideology, at least in part. I mean, people live a normal life in some sense because they seek refuge from the pseudo-reality around them. But once they go out in public, right, and it turns out you don't know who you can trust, right, they have to mouth these platitudes and play the game that the party wants them to play. And as David points out, that turns out to have a pretty important kind of secondary effects down the road, right? The way that Czesław Miłosz puts this is that everyone in a communist world is sort of forced to become an actor. But after a while, it's very difficult to differentiate the kind of public self, the actor self you send out into the world, and then the private self, right? Those two selves kind of bleed and mix together. And so moral agency is something that degenerates in these regimes. And so maybe that's a good place to end. I think I'm almost at 15 minutes. I have a few more remarks, but maybe I can get to those in questions. I think I'll stop there, Brent.
Wonderful. Very nicely done. So everything's moving perfectly so far. I don't know where I got the word slowly. So that doesn't make a lot of sense. Anyway, so maybe because now it's my turn to jump in and help moderate a discussion, I would start by messing it up. We've got some wonderful questions that have come in from the audience, and they go along with some of the questions that I wanted to ask anyway for discussion. So I'm going to sort of blend them together. I want to start with you, Jonathan. And in your talk, you talked about the notion of ideas and implying the sense of motion. I'm wondering if, and by the way, what we'll do is I'll pick each one of you to start a question, but then we'll give all of you a chance to address it. So everybody's going to get a turn as it is. Ideas are interesting things. I'm always struck by the great story attributed to Thomas Carlyle, the Scottish philosopher who was at a dinner party talking about ideas, and somebody was being critical of him for all of his ideas. And he supposedly said, well, there once was a man named Rousseau who wrote a book about ideas, and people laughed, and his next book was bound with their skins. So ideas do have some sort of powerful place in all this, but where do ideas and actions disconnect when we're talking about the imposition of communism?
From my point of view, the disconnect is radical, and it's obvious at the point at which the power of the ruling party is challenged. That's exactly where it happens. It happens every single time for Lenin in 1921 after the Kronstadt rebellion, which again, I want to emphasize, was staged not by whites, not by Mensheviks, not by capitalists, not by monarchists. It was staged by communists who wanted to retain the communist project, but they were rebelling against Bolshevik tyranny. And when he felt challenged in that way, two things happened. One is the resolution on party unity, which is the lever by means of which Stalin was able to expel Trotsky, expel and murder most of his those who challenged him. Why? Because they were destroying the unity of the party. And the second was that Lenin did something that ideologically made no sense, which was at exactly that same time, he started the new economic policy of reintroducing capitalism into the Soviet Union. And the new economic policy lasted from 1921 to after his death in 1924. And he, of course, gives all kinds of reasons why this is not a compromise, because he hated compromise with the capitalists and so on and so forth. This is a strategic retreat, a tactical retreat. But in fact, it is, as David was very eloquently saying, it was the beginning of the lies. But the lies actually don't begin just there. They begin in 1917, 1918, when Lenin is reacting against Kautsky, the arch German socialist, and he writes in The Proletarian Revolution and the Renegade Kautsky, he writes, everything that was imagined before the war happened perfectly. The whole peasantry, the whole of the peasantry was in favor of the revolution. Well, we know this was an absolute lie. It was an absolute, over 200 rebellions took place in 1918 alone. Millions and millions of peasants rebelled against this. But he initiates that lie. Why? Because of ideological reasons? No, because his power is challenged and he knows that he will lose power and the revolution will lose power if he does not create this world of lies. And one lie leads to another, and another, and another, and another. And before you know it, it is, as David was saying, the essence of the ideological system. So you see, I think that the ideology is in the service of protecting power. And the ideology changes as the needs of power are different.
David, this notion of ideas, Marx said that ideas without action were useless. And I'm wondering what your thought is about when is it that the ideas are the cause of the action, and when is it that the action is excused perhaps by or justified by the ideas? Because certainly there's great disconnect between this utopic notion and then what we get in totalitarian countries that do it under the guise of communism, under the wonderful branding, if you will. What is your thought about this disconnect perhaps between ideas and applications and actions?
I think we can look at it as a two-stage process. The ideas are used in order to attract the followers and to mass support under the authority of a group of leaders, who then can use those supporters and those believers for whatever purpose suits the consolidation and expansion of their power. I mean, this is actually inherent in Marxism, Leninism itself. Marxism is the false religion. Marxism is the false religion masquerading as a science, a perfect science, that offered people a glorious future and a break with a corrupt past. Leninism, which was attached to Marxism, was the means for realizing Marxism in a society or in the world. But of course, in terms of its content, it actually contradicts Marxism, because Marx held that the dynamic force of history was the working class, which would take power as a result of the inevitable movement of history. And Lenin said that, in fact, the motive power of the dynamic force of history is a class of professional revolutionaries, the Communist Party, who in fact are often not working class, and in many cases have very little concern for the working class, and who are capable of forcing the pace of history. But in the conflict between, it was Alexander Yakovlev who told me that, who Jonathan knows very well and who I know very well, said that it took him some time to realize, as he himself emerged from communist orthodoxy, that Lenin was the first great revisionist. Revisionism being the great accusation that the communists, the Soviet rulers, threw against anyone who tried to disagree with them. But the reality is that Marxism was the myth. Leninism was the instrument for using the myth in order to oppress the entire population. And of course, when the myth is convenient, when it attracts millions of supporters, when it energizes them to commit unbelievable atrocities, then the myth is at that point, the myth is very welcome. But when the myth gets in the way of the ultimate goal of those who are using the myth, then it can be discarded. You can sign a pact with Hitler. You can institute the new economic policy and at least temporarily restore market relations to the countryside. You can do anything because you have absolute power. And that power has come to you by your ability to cloud the minds and manipulate the behavior of millions of people.
Wonderful. So, Flagg, I'd like to turn to you and in this notion of ideas. You know, you talked about the ideology and the requirement of adherence. You triggered for me something that I often use as a distinction when talking about the difference between philosophy and ideology. I'll typically say that philosophy requires it be applied and ideology requires it be adhered to. Very similar to sort of what you said, but you also talked about the systemic nature of it and the completeness of it. So I'm wondering if you could draw a distinction for people between perhaps a philosophical system and an ideological one. I think Hegel's sometimes considered to be the last great full system philosopher. Of course, Hegel gave Marx part of his weaponry, but Hegel hardly an ideologue, I think. But it is confusing. People use the terms interchangeably, and I don't think that as you used it, you were. So I'm wondering if you could help for our audience, sort of give them a working construct to separate that notion.
Yeah. So I guess I would start. My definition of ideology is a comprehensive political doctrine that specifies the emergence of an order of perfect justice and the means that must be employed to achieve that order. So it's both comprehensive, it specifies the perfect place where we're meant to go. So it has that aspect of perfectionism, utopianism, and it has that character that it specifies the means that have to be employed to get there. And the means themselves then are defined by that inner logicality that I emphasize, that collapses the space between theory and practice. And so if you put all those elements together, I mean, I think that gives you, that's pretty distinctive, right? That's not true of lots of things that we describe as philosophies, ways of thinking about the world. The other way to think about it, I think both David and Jonathan, if memory serves, both kind of use these terms. The political doctrine is often described as a secular religion, right? And so in exchange for conversion, it promises adherents a kind of temporal salvation that claims to conform to a cosmic order that's been scientifically deciphered, right? And so that idea of temporal salvation, I think, gives you a sense that this is different from most of the things that are offered as just philosophies. And then finally, I would say it's the other way to think about it would be to say a philosophy is a rational inquiry, but an ideology is a rational theory that's no longer in a state of inquiry, right? A philosophy is open by its very nature to having questions raised about its character and what it might mean, how its claims might map on to reality as such. But an ideology, right, it thinks it has it all figured out, right? There's no more discussion, there's no more inquiry. It's now time to push human action, right, to bring the world and its character to match the theory, right? The idea that I emphasize with that Havel quote, right? We need to make the world match up to our theory. And that's, that I think makes it very different from most things that are offered as political philosophies. I don't know if that's helped. But.
Wonderful. Help me. I hope it helped the audience. So, David, let me ask you, start with you and talk about this God thing. So you mentioned in your remarks, you talked about the religious aspect in the Soviet Union being built specifically on the notion of atheism. I'm wondering, so as we talk about philosophy, I like to tell people I come from a fixed philosophical marriage. I'm half objectivist, so my pronouns are I and me, and I'm half Catholic, so I feel guilty about my choice of pronouns. So we have communism, of course, with atheism at its center, and yet we have a great anti-communist in Ayn Rand with atheism at her center. So speak to the particular notion and importance of atheism to communist ideology and why it becomes so destructive, if you will.
Well, in religion, it's a question of what is the absolute? What is the absolute? In religion, God is the criterion for moral judgment. Everything that we call the West derives ultimately from two documents, the Ten Commandments and the analogy of the cave in Plato's Republic. In both cases, what is involved is a higher moral order and rules for life that derive from a transcendent source. Now, when in a totalitarian ideology, there are also rules for life, but they don't derive from a transcendent source. They derive from society itself. For example, in the case of Marxism, they derive from the historical process. To a certain extent, in Nazism, it was the same. And the criterion for right or wrong, in fact, the criterion for the judgments about reality itself, were the interests of in the case of Marx, in the interests of the working class, in the case of Nazi, in the interests of the master race. I mean, Nazism in many cases was a somewhat incoherent imitation based on race of Marxist ideology. But to return to Marxism, Lenin made this absolutely explicit in his speech to the Komsomol in 1919. He said that for us, right and wrong is not based on any kind of transcendent consideration. We don't believe any of this claptrap about universal values, that a single standard of right and wrong applies to everyone. And we as Marxists understand that right and wrong is determined by the interests of the revolution and the interests of the working class. Anything that's in the interest of the working class is right. Anything that impedes it is wrong, because the working class is the moving force of history, and meaning is derived from the historical process. Now, obviously, in the case of a transcendent source of authority, right and wrong becomes the province of an individual conscience. But in the case of a source of authority that's located in the social process itself, and is interpreted by a supposedly infallible political leadership, there's no room whatsoever for freedom of thought. And this happens whenever people, in effect, ideologize, even if what we're dealing with is not a totalitarian ideology. The totalitarian ideology, which we've seen in the Soviet Union and in the communist countries, we saw in Nazi Germany and so on, is a total attempt to impose lies and ideology on a population. But the ideologizing tendency, can appear even in democratic societies, in groups that have decided they don't have to think anymore, that something is, for example, politically correct. What does it mean to be politically correct? It means that something is correct in and of itself without reference to any higher authority and without the need of further discussion. Now, obviously, this phenomenon, as repulsive as it may be, does not in the West assume the proportions that it did in the Soviet Union or in Nazi Germany, but it's a fragment of the same type of thinking. And that's the important distinction here. The distinction between a transcendent point of reference and a sense that that judgments about morality are ultimately dependent on considerations which are over and above the passions of society. And on the other hand, a philosophy that assumes that society itself has all the answers, and that all you have to do is identify the correct tendency and absolutize its interests, and you have an infallible guide to knowledge and to morality. Well, that's what happened in the Soviet Union. It happened in Nazi Germany, and it's a tendency that that needs to be controlled in free societies as well.
Okay. So if, let me turn to you, Jonathan, and ask if, with regard to, we think about Marx's ideas on God and the whole notion of religion as the opiate of the masses. We see what has happened in Marx's name over the course of the past century. Did Marx get anything right? He was famous for creating a forward-looking view of a history that had not yet happened, right? Just like Rousseau was famous for creating a view of the past that couldn't be proven. So they were sort of brothers in that sense. One gave us a backwards and one gave us a forwards. Was Marx right about anything in terms of how he structured his take of what was to come?
Oh, I think he was right, certainly, about the ultimate globalization of world markets. I think we're realizing that today. He writes about that quite explicitly in the Communist Manifesto. And at a time when it was difficult to think about true globalization of capitalist economy, I think he got that right. I think the profoundest thing that he got wrong was his complete misunderstanding of human nature. You know, we can talk as much as we like about the atheism of the Bolsheviks, and it's true, but most of the founding fathers of the United States were deists, and they were very light on religion, frankly. Mm-hmm. Some were out and out agnostics. When in 1922, Lenin gives the order to destroy the churches and seize all the church valuables, it's very instructive to see how he justifies this. He does not justify it on the basis of religion is bad, it's the opiate of the masses, we have to destroy religion, let's murder all the priests and blah, blah, blah. He justifies it very simply. We need their gold and silver. We need to stockpile a fund so that we can keep the government going. And therefore, as he puts it very bluntly, when there is cannibalism in the countryside and the peasants are dying and weak and destitute, they are in no position to oppose us. And therefore, he gives the order to ransack all the churches in Russia and Ukraine in particular. Why? Not out of a Marxist principled disdain for religion, but because he's looting the churches. Again, it comes back to power. It comes back to power. And there's a very wonderful interview that Stalin gives to Sergei Eisenstein, the famous filmmaker at the after the war. Eisenstein is making a film on Igor Grozny, Ivan the Terrible. And Stalin doesn't like what he's doing. He says, you know, you're making him into Hamlet. What do you think he is, an English banker, for goodness sakes? Ivan the Terrible? He's the Tsar of Russia. Don't you understand? And he said the only problem with Ivan the Terrible is that he would kill one boyar and then he would run to the monastery and he would seek forgiveness from God. He said if he had killed them all at one time, it would have saved him a lot of trouble. He said, and then he says to Eisenstein a fantastic thing. He said, I think God hindered him in his work. It's a fabulous thing. Stalin says, I think God, in other words, he doesn't deny God. He doesn't say that God does not exist. It's just that, listen, God's work is over here. My work is over here. Let God run the universe. I'm going to run the human world.
Right.
And that's kind of the way he thought about things.
And run it he did.
And run it he did.
So Flagg, as we close in towards the end of our time available, I want to turn to you as a college professor and ask this question that's come from the audience, and it's always a question I have as well. And it's been something that Ken and I have kicked around in conversations. How is it that we somehow or other approach young people today and convince them that communism is bad when communism is created, as we've all talked about here in one way or another, as a utopic abstract idea? And then we try to point to the stories that have been shared here with the panel today, or by the panel today, and they say, well, that's not communism. We haven't tried communism yet. Communism is great. This other stuff isn't really it. So what do we do to reach them with the message that, by the way, Jonathan, I love what you said about having human nature wrong. My email says Hobbes was right. I think if you take Marx's system and you have Hobbes' man, you get Night of the Walking Dead. So, because we seem to get stuck in the killing part, the whole revolution and fighting thing. So, Flagg, what do we do? How do we reach young people?
Well, I have sort of one quip and then one more serious answer. I mean, the quip is the whole we haven't been tried yet. I try to point out that communism has been tried in a heck of a lot of places around the world, but it's kind of turns out the same way no matter where it's tried, and that's a kind of remarkable fact that you have to consider before you resort to this. It's never been tried bit. I mean, we've done it in a lot of different places and across the globe, and no matter how good the intentions, right, the result is kind of shockingly similar. So as a kind of social experiment, that should just tell you something. But the more serious answer is get them to read different accounts of human nature and the human soul and politics and philosophy and literature, and put that alongside the account of human nature to the extent that there is one in Marx and in Lenin, and try to reason through it and talk about it, and then read the great dissidents, read Solzhenitsyn and Havel and Miłosz, and I mean I could go on and on. Jonathan probably has and David both have favorite authors writing under communist regimes, and these people have remarkable accounts of the variety of human experience and the human soul that don't get expressed under communism, right? And so I think the dissident experience is probably the best place to go.
So, Jonathan, you wanted to say something, please.
What I say to my students is simple. It doesn't work. It doesn't work. It doesn't create wealth. And because it doesn't create wealth, they have to steal. And because it doesn't create wealth, they have to force people to work. And because they have to force, people react, people rebel. And that's the system. It's a failed system. If it worked, people would flock to it. And
it's interesting. It's interesting, isn't it, that we're having the same debates that in 2022 that Aristotle and Plato were having between themselves to some extent at the academy. David, we've got about 60 seconds left. Would you like to have a closing thought on how to reach young people with this message?
Well, I think the most important thing is to show them the crimes that were committed, and to show the connection between the ideology and the crimes, because the average person is not a killer, but when he has an ideology, he can be turned into a murderer. And the ideology equips people to stop thinking of individuals and start thinking of masses, and to assume that in the interest of this overarching idea, any crime is justified. Once people understand that connection, the appeal of the ideology will be lost, even if it takes more of an effort to explain to them, because Marxism is complicated. It takes a very lucid explanation for people to understand what's involved. Maybe not everyone will be able to see that. Everyone will be able to see the connection between ideology and mass murder, because it's been documented throughout the 20th century.
Well, on that note, on that powerful note, we will thank all of our panel members for joining us today. It has been a privilege for me to be able to host the conversation. I certainly hope that at some point along the way, Tom Winter and Alan Riskin, our former owners at Human Events, watch this broadcast if they weren't joining us live. and hopefully they'll see that their legacy at Human Events continues through this program and through our relationship with the Victims of Communism Foundation. So thank you for letting me host this. Ken, it's been a privilege. I want to turn it back over to you for closing remarks.
All right. Well, just again, thank you to, first of all, to all of our panelists, Jonathan, David, Flagg, and Brent for agreeing to moderate our event today. Just, incredible insights. Like I said, I've told you guys, every time I speak to you, I learn more every time we talk. So I'll be calling you again for more input on this stuff. It's really a fascinating topic. So if you would like, to our viewers, if you'd like to have more information about this topic, then I would highly suggest you read one of the books from either one of the three gentlemen that were our panelists today. They offer some great insights and really understand the topic at a granular level. There you go. And I highly recommend doing it. Couple other things too. If you want to learn more about the topic of communism, Marxism, the theory, how this all got started, there's a couple ways you can do that. So we host every year a summer seminar that Flagg will be teaching at our museum here in DC, 18 through 22 July. So it's open to middle school, high school teachers, others who are interested in the topic. It's a hybrid event. So if you want to join via, online Zoom or live in person at our museum, please go to our website and you can register there and join us there. Also, if you want to learn more about, for the students, as a former college professor myself, that say that, well, communism has never been tried. We have a museum that just opened dedicated to all those 100 million victims of communism to where it was tried across the world. So that, like our panelists were talking about today, that's really your end product of communism every time it's been tried. A lot of dead people. And it's a sad criminal legacy that this world has endured for far too long. So please come by the museum and learn more about it. And we will have this webinar video on our website, along with our co-host Human Events will be on our site as well to view, and encourage your friends to take a look at it as well. So again, thanks to our panelists for all those who attended, and look forward to hosting you all again on another webinar coming up soon. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you, Ken.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.